Well, let us turn in our Bibles to Luke's Gospel and chapter 20. Luke's Gospel and chapter 20. And being the Sunday immediately before the Easter weekend, today, as I'm sure you know, is commonly known as Palm Sunday. And it marks that historic occasion from 2,000 years ago when Jesus approached the city of Jerusalem on the back of a colt or a donkey. And as he did so, the crowd, we are told in Luke chapter 19, verse 38, burst into song. Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. And as the other gospel writers remind us, they greeted him with the waving of palm branches, some people placing them on the ground for his donkey to walk on. It's a scene that we're perhaps familiar with, either from our Sunday school days or from reading children's Bibles or from more recent films. But what is perhaps not so well known is the sequence of events which followed Jesus' arrival in Jerusalem. Whereas his initial arrival was greeted with a tremendous welcome, subsequent events were marked by bitter hatred and opposition towards Jesus. The opposition began, you may have noticed it, the opposition began rather subtly, as we discovered in our first reading. As the crowds were singing the praises of Jesus, Luke tells us in chapter 19, verse 39, some of the Pharisees in the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher, rebuke your disciples." Those religious leaders, they were jealous. They were furious about the praise that Jesus was receiving on that occasion. And so they tell Jesus to tell his followers, can they turn the volume down a little bit? And it was those religious leaders or their religious equivalents that following that occasion, they ratchet up their opposition to Jesus from that moment on. So much so that chapter 19, verse 47 tells us that every day he was teaching at the temple, but the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the leaders among the people were trying to kill him. As chapter 20 begins, they're questioning him, interrogating him as to his authority, and it is within that context of continuous controversy and against that background of bitter opposition that Jesus tells his little story, or little parable. And as he does so, we see a number of things, and the first thing that we learn about is our failure in our responsibilities towards God, our failure in our responsibilities towards God. Now, if you glance back to the opening verses of this chapter, you'll see that Jesus originally told this story to Jewish people, including the Jewish religious leaders, and as such, he was telling it to people who would have been very familiar with the Old Testament scriptures. And so Jesus' reference in verse 9 to a man planting a vineyard would probably have rung a bell with these people. It would have reminded them of someone else who planted a vineyard. Way back in the 8th century BC, the prophet Isaiah composed a song about God planting a vineyard, and it went like this. We don't have the tune for it, so I'll refrain from singing it to you. But these were the words: "My loved one had a vineyard on a fertile hillside. He dug it up and cleared it of stones and planted it with the choicest of vines." Following that song in Isaiah chapter 5, the prophet gave this explanation: "The vineyard of the Lord Almighty is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah are the garden of his delight." What a privilege Old Testament Israel had, to be that special vineyard that God had planted, but it was a privilege that brought with it responsibilities. Having made Israel his special vineyard, God expected her to produce good fruit, but sadly she produced only bad. He looked for justice, says Isaiah, but saw bloodshed, for righteousness, but heard cries of distress. And 800 years later, Jesus is telling this story to a generation of Jews, and particularly Jewish leaders, who rather than improve the character of the vineyard, they've only made it worse. They've only made it worse. You see, although Isaiah chapter 5 undoubtedly forms the background to this little story, this story has an additional aspect to it in that Israel is not only portrayed as the vineyard, the leaders within Israel are portrayed as the tenants. You all know what a tenant is. They're portrayed as the tenants who are responsible for caring for the vineyard. The story was about those religious leaders, and they knew it. Sometimes Jesus told little parables, and the people went away scratching their heads, not very sure what it meant at all. But this one was not like that. This one was quite clear. And that's why we read in verse 19, the teachers of the law and the chief priests, they looked for a way to arrest him immediately because they knew he had spoken this parable against them. Having heard Jesus tell this little story, they didn't scratch their head and say, oh boy, I haven't a clue what he's talking about. No, they knew perfectly well what he was talking about. They knew it was to them that he was speaking. As tenants of God's vineyard, these people had responsibilities towards God. And that is why the little story tells us in verse 10 that at harvest time the owner sent a harvest to the tenants so that they would give him some of the fruit. Now a landowner, as you know, a landowner doesn't put tenants onto his land just because it's a nice place to stay. No. A landowner puts tenants in so that they will care for the land and so that they will make it productive. That was their responsibility as tenants. But we are told the tenants sent the servant away empty-handed, i.e. with no fruit. They weren't fulfilling their responsibilities as tenants of the vineyard, but worse still, verse 14 indicates that the tenants in the story, not only were they neglecting their responsibilities, they also had ambitions. They had ambitions to take over the ownership of the vineyard. Did you notice that? This is the heir, they said. Let's kill him and the inheritance will be ours. They wanted to make the transition from being tenants to being landlords so that they would be able to do with the vineyard whatever they chose to do. They did not want to be answerable or accountable to anyone. Instead, they wanted to be able to run the vineyard their way. That was their failure as tenants. And that continues to be our failure today. Now, although this story originally applied to the nation of Israel, as I've tried to explain, and their privileged position in history, that does not mean that it has nothing whatsoever to say to the rest of us. Because don't forget, Luke is writing his gospel, his historical account. He's writing for a primarily Gentile audience. And so we can be sure he wasn't recording this incident just so that Gentiles got a bad impression of Jews. No, Luke is recording this incident because it also had something to say to his Gentile readership back then and to us many years later. Although we were not privileged to be that particular vineyard that Isaiah wrote about in the 8th century BC, we have nevertheless known enormous privileges. We've been a privileged people, privileged by God. in one way or another. For some of us, it's been the privilege of growing up in a Christian home. For some of us, it's been the privilege of a church or chapel background where the Bible was regularly read and taught. But for all of us, regardless of family or church background, it's been the privilege of living in God's world. And the challenge this little story presents is, how have we behaved as tenants within the sphere of privilege that we have known? How have we behaved as tenants within God's world? The opening chapters of Genesis remind us that God created this world a perfect and a beautiful place. He then created the man and the woman to be stewards of all that he had made, to care for it and tend it, so that it would produce all that it was capable of producing, so that both it, i.e. the world, and them, the people who populated it, would bring our Creator all the glory that we were intended to bring him. That is the purpose for which we are created. Man's chief end is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. God placed us in the vineyard of this world, so to speak, so that we would produce good fruit as creatures within his creation. But as he comes looking for good fruit this morning, what does he find? Well, you only have to switch on your television or your phone and you quickly discover that the world is not characterized by the sort of things that God intended it to be. What was said of Israel in Isaiah's day could equally be said of us today in this world, and he looked for justice, but saw bloodshed. Isaiah said that almost 3,000 years ago. It could still be the headline on today's 1 o'clock news. He looked for righteousness, but heard cries of distress. And that is what characterizes many parts of our world this morning, is it not? But then let's imagine that you decide to switch off your phone, your television and so on, and you go a month without listening to the international news in order to make you feel better about your place in God's world. And so you go a whole month without any international news, you just listen to the local news. Would that make your little world a perfect place all of a sudden? No. Because although you wouldn't hear about the atrocities in Ukraine or the atrocities in Gaza, you would still hear about plenty of other trouble and crime and violence at a local level, to remind you that human society is not what God intended it to be. And so let's imagine you decide to take another step. Let's imagine that you withdraw further still in order to improve your place within God's world. Let's imagine that you withdrew further still and you packed a month's provision and you sailed to some remote, idyllic island off the west coast of Scotland. Somewhere where you had no contact with anyone or anything. Oh yes, there are places up there that you can achieve that, that's for sure. Would you now be able to say at the end of the month, this is it. I've discovered the perfect vineyard. I've discovered the perfect paradise that I've always been looking for. Would you be able to say that? Well, the peace and tranquility of that island may resemble paradise in some ways, but I suspect that if you were really honest with yourself, at the end of the month, you would find that it hasn't been a perfect paradise after all. And why has it not been a perfect paradise? For the simple reason that you've been there. You've been there. And in spite of being on your own in a beautiful place, you've continued to be the proud, jealous, envious, greedy, selfish, self-pleasing person that you usually are. Even at a personal level. Oh yes, we can look at Ukraine, we can look at Gaza, we can look at Haiti, and we can say, yes, this world has not produced the fruit that God intended it to do when He created it. You don't even need to look that far away. At a personal level, we have not produced the good fruit that our Creator intended us to produce when He placed us on this planet. And the reason we haven't is because, like the tenants in the story, we've not been content with being tenants. Did you realize that? We've not been content with being tenants. By the time we get to Genesis chapter 3, we discover that the first man and the woman, we discover that they weren't content to be tenants in God's world. No. They did not want to be answerable or accountable to the Creator and rightful owner of the world, but instead they wanted to become landlords so that they could do what they wanted in God's world. That was their failure as tenants in this world, and that continues to be our failure as tenants today. We have assumed the role of landlord. In spite of the fact that we are living in God's world, we've assumed the role of landlord in that we think that we can do what we want in God's world and with God's world. That is why the planet's resources have been used in a greedy and a selfish way rather than the way that God intended them to be used. As tenants, we've assumed the role of landlord so that we think we can behave as we want in God's world, answerable, accountable to no one. And that is why we've discarded God-given principles of morality, and instead we've constructed our own. As tenants who have assumed the role of landlord, we've even gone further. And we do all that we can to eradicate the authority and the memory of the real landlord, i.e. God. And so that is why we are keen to remove any traces of God from our education system, from our scientific reasoning, from our legal system, from our social structures, and from our individual lifestyles. Rather than living as tenants who have responsibilities towards the landlord, we want to become landlords ourselves. We want to become the boss of our lives and of the world that we live in. We want to run the ship, as it were. And that is our failure and our responsibilities towards God. Secondly, the second thing we see in the little story is God's patience in spite of our failure. God's patience in spite of our failure. Now, being the landlord, the owner of the vineyard in this story had a right to expect some of its fruit. Did he not? But as we've already discovered, the tenants failed in their responsibility to give him the fruit. Verse 10 tells us that when the servant arrived to collect the produce, they beat him up and sent him away empty-handed. And so what did the landlord do? Well, I don't think we would have been too surprised if the landlord had come along, evicted the tenants there and then. Would we? Would we have been surprised by that? But he didn't. Instead, we are told in verse 11, he sent another servant along. Another one. And would you believe it? The tenants had the audacity to do the same thing again. They beat him up, they treated him shamefully, and they sent him away empty-handed. What will the landlord do this time? If we were expecting him to evict the tenants last time round, then our expectations of eviction and possibly punishment must be even greater this time. But that's not what happened. Verse 12 tells us he sent still a third servant. Now, living in a university town with all so much rented property around, you hear all sorts of bad stories about landlords. from the students, that is. But then during the summer, I usually meet some of the landlords in our street. And what do you hear from them? They go on about how bad the students are. It just goes to show there's two sides to every story, is there not? But whatever stories you may have heard, and whatever side you usually take, I don't think we would question who's at fault in this little story, would we? These tenants have not only failed to hand over the produce the landlord deserves, they have also resorted to violence against the landlord's servants. Even in a society like ours, where the tenants' rights are unbelievably generous these days, I'm sure we would all agree that those tenants deserve to be kicked out and brought to justice. I'm sure we would agree with that. The strange thing is that the landlord hasn't treated them as they deserve to be treated. Instead, he's been very patient with them. Very patient, sending one servant after another, looking for a change of heart on the part of the tenants. But verse 12 tells us that even the third servant was wounded and thrown out. And when that happened, what did the landlord do? Was that the last straw? Third servant kicked out. Is that the last straw? I think if it was, I don't think we could criticise the landlord, could we? But let's look at verse 13 and find out. Then the owner of the vineyard said, "What shall I do?" Listen to this one. "I will send my son, whom I love. Perhaps they will respect him." Can you believe it? Having seen several of his servants rejected and badly treated, he now decides to send along his own son, hoping that that will bring about a change on the part of the tenants. I'm sure you will agree that he's demonstrated enormous patience, enormous grace on the part of this landlord, does it not? Now don't forget, Jesus originally told this story to Jewish leaders, and it was a reminder to them of how God had dealt with them throughout history as a nation. Like the landlord in the story, God had sent servant after servant to the nation of Israel. If you're familiar with Old Testament history, then you'll know the names of some of them. People like Isaiah and Jeremiah and so on. They were God's prophet who came with God's message. But rather than being heard and believed, they were ignored, they were rejected, and in some cases they were even kicked out and persecuted. So much so that God would have been perfectly justified in washing his hands of them and saying, "That's it, enough of enough." But he never. Instead, he showed even greater patience by doing something even more amazing. Like the landlord in the story, God chose to send his own son, his only son, the Son whom he loved. Do you remember what happened as Jesus was coming out of the water on the occasion of his baptism? Recorded for us in Luke chapter 3, a voice came from heaven which said, "You are my son, whom I love." And as these Jews listened to this story, they ought to have realized that the Jesus who is telling the story is himself, the Son, whom God finally sent to the failed tenants of Israel. And in that we see the tremendous patience of God towards failed tenants within Israel and throughout the world. Although the rest of the world wasn't always privileged to hear God's word through the Old Testament prophet, as Israel was, they were still privileged to have a constant reminder of God's existence and of God's glory and of God's goodness surrounding them day by day. Just because you weren't part of that Old Testament nation that had those great privileges, don't think that you can say, well, I'm not responsible. Oh, yes, you are responsible. Do you realise that the sheer wonder and beauty and magnificence of the world you live in was and still is a clear and vivid testimony to the existence and the character of the God who has placed you here? And yet, just as Israel ignored and rejected the prophets that God sent to her, so we in the rest of the world have ignored. And we've rejected the revelation which God has given of himself in the creation around us. And yet, rather than forever writing this world off as he could have done, the Bible tells us that God loved this world. And he loved it so much that, like the man in the story, he sent his only Son into this world. A world that had rejected all that God had previously showed of himself. A world that rejected all that God had previously said to them. He sent his only Son into this world in order to save it. Can you believe it? That is what God has done for a world of failed tenants like you and me. That is what God has done for a world of tenants who were not producing the fruit that we were supposed to, and were trying to take over the running of the show and the ownership of the property. He sent his Son. That is what God has done for men and women like us, who, although living in God's world, are doing all that we can to ignore him. That is the patience and grace of God towards failed tenants like us. And the big question for us this morning is, as it was for these people in the story, and as it was for the people of Jesus' day, the big question still is, how will we respond to the coming? No longer the coming of a servant. How will we respond to the coming of the Son? How have we responded to the landlord sending his Son into this world? That is the big question. Thirdly and finally, the other thing we see in this little story is a word of warning to those who reject the Son. A word of warning to those who reject the Son. Now, contrary to what the landlord in the story had hoped for, the sending of his Son didn't produce a massive change in the attitude of the tenants. Instead, it actually brought out the worst in them. Did you notice that? It brought out the worst in them. It revealed just how bad they really were. That's why we read in verse 14, when the tenants saw the Son coming, you'd have thought, oh boy, he's sending his Son now. It's time we changed tact. It's time we pulled up our socks and started behaving a little bit better. No, when they saw him, the Son coming, they talked the matter over and they said, hey, this is the heir. Let's kill him. Because if we kill him, the inheritance will be ours. So they threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. The question now is, how will the landlord respond to this latest and greatest of insults? Don't forget, the landlord, he sent servant after servant after servant. He was so patient, so gracious, time and time again. How will the landlord respond to this latest and greatest of insults? Now that they've rejected and killed the Son, what will his response be? Is the landlord going to shrug his shoulders and say, well, that's it. That's just life in this world. You win some and you lose some. Is the landlord going to remain indifferent towards such cruel and wicked and completely unjustified treatment of his own Son? What is he going to do? What then will the owner of the vineyard do to them, is the question that's asked at the end of verse 15. And the answer, verse 16, he will come and kill those tenants and give the vineyard to others. And we are told that when the people heard this, they said, "May this never be. May it never be." They said that not because they had tremendous sympathy for the wicked and deceitful tenants in the story, but because they were beginning to realise that the story was actually about them. About them. Having rejected prophet after prophet after prophet throughout Old Testament history, these Jewish leaders, they're already plotting. As we read, they're already plotting the death of the Son whom God had sent. Rather than bring about a change in them and in their attitude, the sending of the Son, just as in the story, the sending of the Son would actually bring out the worst of them, just as it did in the parable. And that worst would be vividly and graphically displayed over the next few days as they cruelly and brutally treat God's Son. So much so that by the end of the week, they will nail him to a cross outside Jerusalem. But what they are now hearing from the lips of Jesus is a word of warning. A warning that God will not turn a blind eye towards such treatment of his Son. Instead, he will respond to it, and he will respond to it in judgment. Those who treat his Son that way would be punished, and the privileges they had known as a nation throughout history would be given to others, i.e. to Gentile, to non-Jewish people. But the tragedy this morning, the tragedy is that most Gentile people haven't responded to the coming of the Son any differently or any better from the Jewish people before them. And that's why the warnings of judgment at the end of this story continue to be relevant for us today. Because we haven't responded any better. Quoting the Old Testament book of Psalms, Jesus says, "The stone the builders rejected has become the capstone. Everyone who falls on that stone will be broken to pieces, but he on whom it falls will be crushed." That is a quotation from Psalm 118. And it was written before the days of mass-produced concrete breeze blocks. Builders back then selected each stone individually to fit a particular space and to play a particular role in the construction of a building. But the picture here is one particular stone in the pile that never gets selected. It's just continually, each time a builder picked that up and looked at it, it was rejected. But then there came a time when that repeatedly rejected stone becomes the capstone or the cornerstone of the building. In other words, it became the most important stone in the whole structure. And the point that Jesus is making is that although he was currently and persistently being rejected by religious leaders who saw no place for him in God's work in this world, that same one was soon going to become the most important person in God's dealings with this world. He is God's Son, and he was soon going to accomplish God's great plan of redemption upon the cross and then be exalted to the place of supreme authority within the universe, a position that he continues to hold today. Oh yes, the stone that was repeatedly rejected throughout history has become the cornerstone. And the point which Jesus is making in quoting Psalm 118 is that those who persistently ignore or reject this Jesus will one day be judged by him. Those who persistently see no place for Jesus in their lives will one day be punished by him. That is the solemn warning that Jesus delivers here to those who reject the Son. Sadly, the Jewish leaders of that day never responded to that warning as they should have done. Rather than heed that warning, verse 19 tells us that they looked for a way to arrest him immediately because he had spoken this parable against them. In other words, in spite of the warning. In spite of the warning, they persisted in their rejection of the Son. And in doing so, they would suffer the dreadful consequences that Jesus has spelt out here. And that was their response back then to the Son whom God had sent into this world. And the question we need to ask this morning is, what will our response to him be? What will our response to him be? In spite of men and women's persistent rejection of the revelation that God had given of himself in creation, in spite of that persistent rejection, God in love has sent his Son, the Lord Jesus Christ, so that those who believe in him will not perish as they deserve to do, but instead will have eternal life. That is the purpose for which God has sent his Son. And so the question we need to ask ourselves this morning is this: how have we responded to the coming of the Son? Have we believed in the Son whom God has sent? Have we put our trust and our confidence in him to save us from the judgment that our rebellion and our rejection of God's previous revelation deserves? Have we submitted to him and acknowledged him to be the rightful landlord of our lives and of this world? Or have we persisted in our rebellion towards our Creator to the extent that we've even refused and rejected the Son? If that is the case, then please remember the solemn warning that Jesus gives here to those who reject the Son. Three things we see in Jesus' little story about the tenants. We see firstly our failure and our responsibilities towards God. Secondly, we see God's patience in spite of our failure. And then thirdly, a word of warning to those who reject the Son.